There are competing historical narratives about the relationship between Jerry Falwell Sr.'s moral majority movement and social issues like racial equality, equal rights, and religious freedom. On this episode of Recollecting Carter, I talk with Dr. Gillian Frank about the politicization of abortion during Carter's presidency. While this episode focuses on historical facts about abortion, as opposed to political or religious viewpoints, be aware that some listeners may be sensitive to this content.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
the time for racial discrimination is over.
that I will faithfully execute
an undiminished, ever-expanding American dream.
the office of President of the United States.
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
And will, to the best of my ability,
It is a crisis of confidence.
preserve, protect, and defend
To remove the light of war, the threat of war, would be the overwhelming dream that I've had.
the Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
Hi, my name's Gillian Frank. I'm the co-host of the Sexing History podcast. I'm also a historian of religion and sexuality.
Abortion is a very hot-button political issue today. Most people are aware that it's a political issue, but that's not always been the case, at least not in the way that it is today. So what was the political landscape surrounding abortion in the 1970s, and how is that different than it is today?
Abortion was becoming politicized starting in the 60s and taking on the hue of party politics by the 1970s. What we can say is that at the beginning of the 1970s, there was many legislative debates over abortion reform and abortion repeal. You could find legislative proposals in pretty much every state across the country was considering it in some way, shape, or form. Whether these made it out of committee or made it to the floor of a state legislature or got passed was often the subject of fierce debate and political contestation, usually with Catholics taking the lead as anti-abortion activists and a conglomeration of religious and secular forces leading the charge for abortion rights. Now, in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, both had liberal and conservative wings and were often deeply divided within and between themselves over abortion. But what starts to happen circa 1972 and really earlier under Nixon is that he tries to seize the abortion issue as part of his quest to build what they were calling a silent majority, a conservative coalition organized around popular cultural issues. This was part of his attempt as well to peel away working class, middle class, Catholic, white voters away from the Democratic Party and into the Republican fold. And so they introduced a number of issues, including abortion, but also busing for the purposes to integrate school, discussed with campus unrest, all of these things to exploit and polarize, as they called it, cultural divides. So Nixon in the midterm elections of 1970 starts already to play his hand. He tries and succeeds in banning abortion provisions on military bases. They were being offered there, and he signals his so-called pro-life commitments as a way of courting Catholic voters. By 72, he's full on signaling his anti-abortion positions. And in this way, he's trying to make it so that Republicans, or at least conservative Republicans, are glomming on to his campaign. And it builds from there. So you got to remember in 72, this is before Roe v. Wade. We're on the eve of Roe v. Wade, November 72. But it's already animating voters in places like Michigan where there's a referendum, in North Dakota where there's a referendum on abortion reform, and in countless legislators across the country. It's coming on the heels of New York State, which had just passed the most liberalized abortion set of legislation ever. They repealed their abortion law and had no residency requirements. Hawaii had legalized. North Carolina had legalized or liberalized. And so it's becoming a flashpoint, and there are all these national and local movements that are anti-abortion movements that are getting formed at this time. And so this is on the eve of Nixon's second election. Within a couple of months, Roe happens, right? Early 1973. And at that point, we have a flip in the script. Up until this moment, we have a huge momentum on the part of the abortion rights movement. They are playing offense. They're trying to reform and repeal laws. They're trying to attack basically cultural and legal precedents that have been on the books for anywhere between 6 to 10 decades, depending on when the anti-abortion legislation was passed or reintroduced. And now Roe is the law of the land, and the folks who are playing offense are now playing defense, and the people who are trying to contain or control abortion rights are anti-abortion foes. And so the Republican Party over time is trying to capture that momentum.
Yeah, it seems like abortion was very divisive then, as it is now, in some ways that are similar to today, but also in some ways that are different. So let's dive into that a little bit more. You mentioned that there are conservative and liberal wings of both parties at the time, and you mentioned that there was this religious interest in banning abortion from the Catholic Church, but you didn't talk as much about some of the other more dominant faiths, traditions in America. So how did abortion become that political lightning rod that it has for both, partisan politics and American Christianity?
The first thing I would say is that when we talk about the religious landscape, in the present as in the past, I want us to think American Christianities, plural. Always multiple denominations, always denominations in conversation and sometimes in contest with each other, and often in hot debate with themselves. So to understand the evangelicalization of the abortion debate, we need to think about a few things happening. With the passage of Roe, and even earlier, the meaning of abortion is changing. So the abortion rights movement can be thought about in two camps. Abortion reform, which is allowing abortion under certain circumstances, whether it's in cases of sexual violence, cases of fetal deformity, cases of the health of the mother, preserving her life, and some other provisions, whether they're medical or social. But there was a fair amount of medical gatekeeping involved, and a fair amount of deeming the people who can access it as somehow worthy. The second camp of the abortion rights movement was abortion repeal, which is to say that the moral agency and the locus of choice resides with the pregnant person who opts for it. It was called abortion on demand. Now, for many, abortion reform, this idea of limited access under extenuating circumstances, it was morally palatable, particularly for evangelicals, many of whom had great discomfort with the idea of abortion, particularly if it was seen as a form of birth control or if the people were seen as morally unworthy. And so we see official approval for more abortion reform, but abortion repeal for many evangelicals was a bridge too far. And so after the passage of Roe in 73, where abortion repeal became the law of the land, where abortion access became a private decision between a pregnant person and their doctor, this accelerated widespread discomfort. As well, the thing that's happening is, as the ERA movement, anti-ERA movement, gets launched, with as this becomes another hot button issue, Phyllis Schlafly, who helped spearhead and lead the anti-ERA movement, begins to associate abortion with feminism. So, pre-Roe, some feminists got associated with abortion, but it was a broad-based movement, at first spearheaded by professionals like lawyers, doctors, law enforcement, who were trying to make a more compassionate law, as well as liberal religious clergy. After Roe, there was a remaking of the meanings of abortion. It was, by the anti-ERA movement, deemed a feminist issue that was going to destroy motherhood and the family. And so this, again, is a radical politicization and transformation of the meanings of abortion. What is starting to happen then is that evangelicals, already discomforted by abortion on demand, begin to get harnessed into the process of party realignment. We see Republicans becoming the party of conservatives, Rockefeller Republicans and others getting pushed out, and Democrats becoming the vehicle for progressive, liberal politics that are associated with gay rights, with feminism, with the civil rights movement. And so, really, prior to Roe, the Republican Party was the most reliable vehicle for abortion reform, abortion repeal. And that starts to flip after Roe. Now, this flipping takes years and years, but it's being accelerated by the changing meaning of abortion.
So you mentioned that Roe v. Wade is passed during Nixon's second term. And we've kind of talked about, that flipping taking several years. And of course, we know that as we get to today, it is the exclusive purview of the right or the Republican Party to be anti-abortion. But where does Jimmy Carter fit into all this? Because on the one hand, both his critics and his celebrants would largely agree that he is the most Christian president we've ever had. But on the other hand, his line on abortion really picks up the phrase that you mentioned earlier, that it should be between a woman and her doctor. So how does that happen in that sort of middle space in between Nixon and Reagan with President Carter?
Carter is, as you note, at this key interstitial moment. Roe passes in 73, and really from 73 up until the middle of Carter's presidency, 78, 79, we are seeing a flourishing of abortion provision and abortion access. We're also seeing a rising anti-abortion movement, but Carter tends to adopt the line of where mainline Protestantism is and liberal Judaism is, which is medical privacy prevails. So we don't see him politicizing it. But what we do see on the ground is a growing coalition of anti-abortion activists who have been taught through the anti-ERA movement, have been taught through groups like the National Right to Life, who are both Protestant, which is to say evangelical, Catholic, and also we're seeing growing numbers of Mormons who are absorbing this material, coming to think of it as part of a broader assault on the family. And so we see a rising family values politics that is manifesting itself early on, ERA, gay rights organizations or anti-gay backlashes, which are taking place during the Carter administration. And Reagan himself is tapping into these during the primary campaigns and as he's building close relationships with what we would now call the religious right, groups like the Moral Majority and Christian Cause. And so what Carter is doing is trying to take the line of the mainstream medical establishment, the mainstream legal establishment, and certainly the majority of mainline Protestantism and Judaism, which is to say that we need to see this as belonging to the zone of privacy. The opposite argument is being made by the religious right, which is these issues that you are rendering private are actually deeply moral, deeply political, and are cause for state intervention so as to save America from whatever moral catastrophe they claim is befalling it. Right? And so we'll see these pairings. The liberals, the Democrats, they support abortion, homosexuality, pornography, and abortion becomes latched onto the laundry list of things that are dangerous. Abortion and busing, and so on and so forth.
You mentioned Reagan and the primary campaign, that he was ultimately successful in making Carter just a one-term president. And of course, Reagan would not only go on to have 2 terms himself, but then his vice president would have another term after him. So, really, the 80s are the Reagan years. But a big part of that power you've kind of touched on is this coalition that Reagan developed kind of picked up where Nixon left off. Is that right? With religious groups and the so-called Southern strategy and things like that.
Absolutely. And so he's offering a vision of anti-statism, less government, which is often code for less civil services, particularly for the most vulnerable among us, anti-welfare rhetoric, but also giving, if not overt, tacit approval to a host of cultural issues, including endorsing those or supporting those who oppose gay rights, who oppose feminism, who oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, who oppose abortion. And so there is, again, a winnowing away of the liberal Republicans, the Rockefeller Republicans, and growing what political historians call realignment, where people's politics, whether it gets called conservative or liberal, becomes seen as part of just one party vehicle rather than wings within the party. Now, granted, this is still ongoing in the Reagan era. There are people who will split their votes down the line according to specific ideological issues. State parties might differ from the federal branches. But what we are again seeing is the ways in which cultural issues become levers to turn many gears and move voters to the polls.
There's a common narrative about the union between Reagan and, let's say specifically, Jerry Falwell Sr., that it was a moral outrage about abortion, and that was really the thing that brought them together and really the thing that kind of gave rise to a lot of the current religious and political context that we have today. What's right about that narrative, and what are some of the historical details that are wrong? And it's important that we understand, what the details were.
So I'm going to sort of reframe the question for a second, because I think what you're referring to is how the political utility of abortion and how that arises in the late 70s / early 80s, and why the religious right and conservatives in general glom on to abortion issues. The narrative that you're referring to is one that sees evangelicals utilizing abortion as somehow cynical, as a displacement of their racism. And so the scholar who has advanced this basically says, people are trying to see abortion as the real origins of the religious right. We need to look for race. Now, that's a straw man construction. Most scholars of the religious right, of the rise of conservatism, see it as multiple movements nestled in each other with complex and overlapping motivations that bring them together under the umbrella of Reagan, sometimes uncomfortably, sometimes more comfortably, right? It's not just a neat pairing where you put on a snug pair of pants. Sometimes it's a little tight, sometimes there's holes in the seams, to really belabor this metaphor. So the question becomes, when and why do we see abortion become politicized? And I've spoken to this a little bit, but I'm going to put it really concretely. And I'll say what it's not. It is not a cynical attempt to somehow mask the racism on the religious or the far right of American politics. In fact, we see this overtly pronounced in a number of cultural signals that the Reagan administration gives, if not outright policy, from the gutting of the welfare state to the ways in which there is a commitment to upholding racial status quos, whether that's not supporting busing or integration and so forth, right? The racism, the language of race, the ways in which race becomes a polarizing issue, Southern strategy never goes away. So abortion is not simply displacement for this. Second point, abortion becomes politicized and a right-wing issue, really, as I gestured before, starting in the 60s, and evangelicals are discovering it then. The key to understanding their growing animus towards abortion is to pinpoint it towards the changing meaning of abortion. When it goes from abortion reform to abortion repeal, abortion just for some to abortion on demand, this catalyzes a shift in meaning of it. The other thing that happens is the Catholicization of evangelicals through a number of vehicles, whether it's the National Right to Life, which is trying to circulate their material in non-Catholic ways so it can be consumed and distributed by other religious groups, to the anti-ERA movement, which is led by Schlafly, a devout Catholic, that is teaching people that abortion is not just a sin, but a threat to the family unit, along with a host of other things, including feminism, including gay rights. So we're getting the laundry list of moral demons that become a staple of conservative We can call it Christian right thought. This is ongoing and is happening well before the late 70s. As this particular scholar would assert, evangelicals didn't care about it, but then somehow in the late 70s they did. It was actually ongoing, a slow build. And the way it's a slow build is it's happening on the grassroots with individual congregations and pastors, and also through organized social movements. And it is happening alongside, thoroughly wedded to, broader concerns about what is the nature of the welfare state, what are our commitments to racial equality in the civil rights movement, how should we understand equal rights for women, what is the function of a government in society. All of these are interconnected to each other. And what we begin to see is a vision of government as a moral police force. We need to stamp out abortion. This is from a conservative point of view. We need to disallow gays from having rights honored by the government. And we need to deregulate everything else when it comes to finances and let the market take care of everything else. And so there's a sort of strange and uneven and turbulent intersection between sexual, economic, and racial politics. But I will say, and I can't emphasize this enough, the sexual politics of the far right were decades in the making and were never just a displacement of earlier issues. Rather, they mark an overlap, an intersection, a layering, if you will, of it on top of all sorts of other concerns held by both everyday Americans and those who would sort of wed that to a particular political party.
Great, thanks so much. Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.